Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level learners of English. On today's episode of Thinking in English, I want to give you all some tips and advice on how to improve your small talk skills. Head over to the Thinking in English blog for a full and free transcript of today's episode. Have a look at my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, and leave a like, rating, review, or follow wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's episode. A lot of the topics I cover on Thinking in English are focused on advanced discussions, debates, social issues, and political problems. Moreover, I've recorded episodes on how to be a better public speaker, how to perform well in job interviews, and how to become a more active learner. However, in daily life, small talk is probably a much more valuable and desirable skill for many English learners and listeners of this podcast. Rather than learning complicated grammar structures, learning how to use effective small talk is a really appealing and obviously useful skill. And this is true in my case too. I much prefer small talk than learning grammar or vocabulary. Small talk is defined as polite conversation about unimportant or uncontroversial matters, especially as engaged in social occasions. So, compared to prepared situations like a speech or a presentation, small talk and conversations can actually be far more challenging and daunting tasks for language learners. You can plan a presentation, practice, double check your grammar, and prepare for any likely questions from the audience. But small talk can often take you by surprise. Let me give you an example of a recent casual conversation or small talk that left me completely confused. A few months ago, I went to watch a baseball game in Tokyo at the home of the Tokyo Swallows, or as they are also commonly known, the Yakult Swallows, as they are sponsored by the Yakult yogurt brand. On the way home, I stopped in at my local bar, ordered a beer, and struck up conversation with a few of the customers inside. A lot of standard small talk, I guess. And I should mention that this conversation, this small talk, was completely in Japanese. And while I'm definitely not fluent, I love speaking to people. I mentioned to the bar that I had been to watch the Swallows play baseball, and the man to my left started to ask me what I thought about New San Kin. Now, this is a Japanese word, so don't worry if you don't understand it. I speak okay Japanese, but I had no idea what it meant. I was trying to think of all of the baseball or Tokyo terminology I knew, but I couldn't work out what New San Kin was. So I pulled out my smartphone, opened up Google Translate, typed out New San Kin, and the result was lactic acid bacteria. Turns out, when I mentioned watching the Yakult Swallows, the bar decided not to talk about baseball or not to talk about Tokyo, but instead to talk about the fermented yogurt drinks and specifically the bacteria inside, because the sponsor of the team is Yakult, a yogurt drink. Nothing could have prepared me for this conversation, and this is why learning the basics of small talk is so important. Learning how to continue a conversation even if you don't really know what is going to come up. Outside of social occasions, and in my case, bars, small talk is also an essential skill in business settings. In business, almost every situation starts with a conversation first. When you're hiring an employee, making a sale, negotiating a contract, or just discussing something with your colleagues, small talk is an important part of all of these situations. Small talk breaks the ice. It starts the conversation off on the right foot. Small talk is not just difficult for English learners, it's something that everyone, even native speakers, struggles with occasionally. However, for English learners, small talk does pose extra challenges. Why? Well, it can be a conversation about almost anything. As my anecdote earlier showed, you could face having to talk about lactic yogurt drinks in a bar in Tokyo. I'm sure you all have excellent vocabulary skills, but most English learners struggle with having a wide vocabulary. It's incredibly difficult to discuss random, unimportant topics if you don't have the appropriate vocabulary. A few common but very broad small talk categories include the weather, entertainment, sports, family, work, food, travel, celebrity gossip, hobbies, or your hometown. Can you respond to questions on all of these topics? Small talk that I've been engaged in recently included the Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp trial, the best ramen restaurant in Western Tokyo, Fijian culture, Japan's recent heat wave, and the results of recent rugby games. And you definitely need a wide amount of vocabulary to discuss all of these issues. And over the last 6 or 7 years, I've taught thousands of conversation classes online, which all involve a lot of small talk. I've definitely improved my ability to small talk over the past few years, so I thought I'd share a few tips and tricks that I have picked up over the years. The first thing to remember is that a conversation involves both speaking and listening. You need to concentrate and focus on both of these skills to become better at conversations and small talk. So, here are some tips on how to improve. First tip is a simple one: listen. Try to be a good listener. Stay engaged in the conversation and make comments relevant to what you hear. What is a good listener, you might ask? Well, a good listener is someone who is actually interested in what other people have to say. All too often, English learners are busy thinking about their next comment, the next sentence they want to say, instead of actually listening to what their conversation partner is saying. So try not to make this mistake. Be a critical listener. Try to understand the intentions of other people and make sure you are involved in the conversation. I think a connected piece of advice to being a good listener is to encourage or help the other person to talk as much as possible. If you ask them questions or start conversations on topics your conversation partner is comfortable with, conversations become much easier. What topic can everyone talk about, though? Well, there is one thing: themselves. Everyone can talk about themselves. So when you start a conversation about the other person, the conversation will naturally continue. Tip number 2 is to ask questions. And not just any questions, but good questions. Asking a question is the best way to start a conversation, and asking open ended questions can get really interesting responses. An open ended question is a question that encourages your partner to give a more detailed answer. For example, if you ask, "Do you like football?" the answer is either yes or no. And then the conversation will end there and you'll have to start again, think of a new topic. However, if you ask, "What sport do you like?" the conversation has many different ways to advance. For example, "I like football." "Oh, what team do you support?" And you can keep asking questions like this. I think open ended questions are the most useful tool for improving your small talk skills. They just help to keep the conversation going. If you are having small talk with someone you have met before, you could try remembering details you've heard about the person and ask questions about this, and then ask more follow up questions. For example, "I haven't seen you since your vacation. How was your trip to New York?" Right? An open ended question. How was your trip to New York? Instead of saying, "Was your trip fun?" you say, "How was your trip?" And then after you hear their reply, you could ask something about what they said, maybe the food, the culture, the weather, the experience. The next tip is to learn when to listen and learn when to speak. A conversation requires at least two people. So remember this. Everyone involved should have the opportunity to speak, ask questions, listen, and be involved in the conversation. Of course, you should be an active participant in the conversation too, but you shouldn't completely control or dominate small talk. That is not the best way to make a fantastic impression. Make sure to ask questions of the other person so that you don't just talk about yourself. But you should also avoid asking too many questions. If you just ask question after question, it can start feeling like an interview or an interrogation rather than small talk. So learn when to listen, learn when to ask questions, and learn when to speak or make a comment yourself. The next tip is to research and be prepared. Small talk topics can be various and wide ranging. If you know who you are going to talk with, you could think about the kind of topics they would be interested in. When I teach online, I tend to be very prepared for small talk with students from East Asia, as I live here and I research the region's politics and social systems. So, whenever someone from Japan or Taiwan, Korea or China has a class with me, small talk is generally quite easy because I know a lot of things about these areas. However, in the past, when I've had classes with people from other parts of the world, small talk is a little more difficult because I know less about other parts of the world. If you are meeting with a person or a group of people who share a common interest, maybe football or Marvel movies or hiking, you could take some time to learn a little specific vocabulary related to these topics. Small talk is often about current events. So, another good tip is to keep up with recent events, read the news, and pay attention to the world. My friends are all interested in political issues and world news. So, our small talk always tends to revolve around these issues. And a final tip I want to introduce today is that there are some topics you should stay away from, especially in business situations or the first time you meet someone. Small talk is supposed to be casual, polite conversation about unimportant issues. And of course, small talk with your friends will be slightly different, and you can talk about more topics with your friends. But in general, for when you're meeting someone for the first time, try to avoid talking about strong political beliefs or religion. Talking about things like this can be a little off putting. You're having a conversation, small talk. You're not trying to recruit or convince your conversation partner. When you talk about your own personal or strong convictions, it can sometimes make the small talk uncomfortable, especially if the other person disagrees with you or has a different opinion to you. A few common topics you should try to avoid include finances or salaries, death, religion, politics, or really personal issues. So here is today's final thought. Small talk can be daunting for English learners. The conversation can be about anything. The topics are wide ranging, and you need to be aware of what is being said. However, if you listen well, ask questions, and prepare a few topics, and stay away from controversial topics, small talk can be a really enjoyable experience. Do any of you listening have any tips for small talk in English? If you do, please let me know. Please let us all know. Write a comment on the blog, write a comment on Spotify, or send me a message on Instagram. My Instagram is Thinking in English Podcast, and we've just hit 5,000 followers, which is absolutely incredible. there's definitely more than 5,000 people who listen to this podcast. So maybe some more of you should go and give me a follow on Instagram, and maybe we can get to 10,000 by the end of the year. I'm hoping. Leave a follow, a like, a rating, a review, wherever you are listening to the podcast right now. We're over 1,000 Spotify ratings, which is absolutely amazing. Let's try and get to the most popular English language podcast in the whole world. That's my ambition. And if you'd like to donate to the podcast, you can do. There's a link in the description, or head over to the blog. The blog is thinkinginenglish.blog, as I say a lot. And I think that's everything. So I really appreciate all of your support, and I hope you all have a really good day. Thank you for listening.